if you were here last year, we had Sir David King here last year, and so I thought that it would be a nice way to start up this year, which is what's happened in a year then, David?
Well, what's happened over the past year has already been covered by Jim. We experienced not just the hottest year on record, but significantly warmer than before, 0.2, 0.3 degrees warmer than any other year. And that is possibly due to an El Nino effect, but this is a remarkably large El Nino effect, if that's what it is, and it's extending into 2024. So I think that's the first thing. The globe that we live on is already showing signs of rejecting our lifestyle that we have been very comfortable with over a few thousand years. As we move forward, the warming of the oceans is, of course, also extremely worrying. And there we're talking about an even higher extreme temperature in the oceans. That is, the surface of the global oceans average is now 0.4, 0.5 degrees centigrade higher than previous years. So we're looking at an enormous series of challenges, and I think Guterres might have made a phrase that struck a chord with people. I'm sure that's why he said what he said. We're moving into a boiling planet. He's really saying it's moving away from us, and we're not doing enough to manage the challenge.
So is that the way that you would describe it too? We are in the era of global boiling.
I think it's a fair description. It's not the words I would use. I would certainly say we are in the post-Pliocene era. We're into our own developed climate change entirely through our actions, and it's as if we have a death wish. We don't seem to understand that we depend on our ecosystems. We live by and with our ecosystems. We are a part of our ecosystems, and here we are destroying them. And I'm just astonished at the poor response of much of the world today.
We'll talk more about that. Emily, you have been saying, you've said before, for too long climate change has been seen as tomorrow's problem. Is that changing?
Well, I think in part it's changing because we start to see the impacts of climate change play out around the world in terms of some of the extreme weather events, most recently extreme flooding events that we've been seeing, but wildfires in recent years as well, causing absolute devastation, and the very extreme temperatures that we've been seeing in summer here in the UK. And I think that that's starting to really highlight the very real human impact of climate change. Those extreme heat waves, we know that particularly elderly people are very much at risk in this country from those extreme temperatures. We've seen the impacts of flooding events, both in terms of displacement of tens of thousands of people in some of those extreme flooding events we've been seeing, and then the impacts of that both on mental health, the impacts on the spread of diseases like cholera. Actually, my colleagues at the University of Cambridge who study antimicrobial resistance, which is its own real problem, say that some of the hotspots of that spreading of antimicrobial resistance are exactly in flooding events. So those are just some of the health impacts of climate change. But the other really critical health impact is where we're seeing increasing spread of diseases. So spread of malaria or spread of dengue fever. Last summer, Paris ended up fumigating significant areas of Paris precisely because of the concern of dengue fever spreading. We're starting to see it spreading into southern Europe. So those health impacts, I think, are something that's starting to be really recognized as being a significant problem, and just one example of those human impacts of climate change that are now arriving.
And when those problems go to environments that haven't previously had them, is that it's a bad moment? Is it also a powerful moment in terms of an understanding of what's going on?
Well, I hope it's just yet another really clear warning sign of the future that could be ahead of us if we don't take this issue really seriously. I mean, I feel and I'm sure that Ed and Dave feel the same. I do feel a little bit like a broken record, having been saying the same message now for 30 years or so. And it does. I mean, in all honesty, and I'm sure that Ed and Dave would say the same, that it's almost. Sometimes when, as a scientist, it's a little bit heartbreaking, if I'm really honest, because, it's been so clear for such a long time now, from the scientific perspective, about the risks posed by climate change. And we've been doing our best in different ways to try and communicate as widely, as loudly as we can, what those risks are. And it sometimes feels as though try as hard as we can, we just haven't really been listened to. And that, as I say, is a little bit heartbreaking. We keep going, we keep trying, we keep trying to communicate the message, the scale of the challenge, the urgency of challenge, and to pick up on something that Jim said a moment ago, that there is still hope.
Uh-huh.
We do, this is, again, that's almost the other element of the heartbreaking element of this.
Yeah.
We know what we should be doing. We know what we could be doing. We know where the opportunities actually lie in terms of the response of building a more sustainable world for everyone that is healthier, both in terms of human health and the health of the natural world.
On the issue of communication, Ed, you used a novel way to communicate in a graphic climate change, and you care about it so much, you're wearing it today.
I am, yes. I'm wearing my climate stripe socks, yes.
And the lining of the jacket.
Yes.
So, I mean, just explain to people that haven't seen it what that image is and what it shows.
Yeah, I mean, so this is a simple set of coloured stripes which represent the changes that we've seen in temperature over the last 150 years or so. And it's just a very simple, stark visual to communicate to anyone with a single glance what's happened to our climate. The stripes changed from mainly blue back in the 19th century to very dark red today, highlighting the fact that our planet's climate has changed and that we've warmed up. And this graphic has been used everywhere. It's been adopted as a global symbol, if you like, of our changing climate. And it's instantly understandable by anyone, and it can be adapted for many uses. So we've seen it used at rock concerts. We've seen it used at London Fashion Week. A fashion designer called Lucy Tamam made a whole series of outfits based on the climate stripes to communicate to that world. They've been used by Reading Football Club as part of their kit last season. And this is important because it's bringing the climate conversation to different audiences who wouldn't normally talk about it. And we do need to talk about climate change more amongst our friends, our family, and our colleagues to enable people to have these discussions about the risks that we face and what we can do about it by normalising the responses and making it part of everyday conversation, like we talk about the health service or we talk about anything else. We can talk about what we can do to tackle this problem.
Why do you think we don't? I mean, Emily said there is still hope. Do some people think there isn't? It's too big, I can't deal with it. What's going on?
I mean, we always have hope. Because we are causing this, it's in our hands to change direction. It's our choices which matter. And we are at a crossroads at the moment. It is our choices as a global society over the next decade or two which determine what happens next. It is down to us. It's this generation, ourselves, who are faced with this decision about what to do and to make these choices. Until we reach global net zero, global temperatures will continue to increase. The only way we can do it is by stabilising global temperatures is by reaching global net zero. And that's an enormous challenge, which we recognise. And if we don't, then global temperatures continue to increase and the risks that Emily has highlighted continue to increase. We'll continue to get hotter heat waves, heavier rainfall events, rising sea levels, more conducive conditions for wildfires in different parts of the world. These are enormous risks that we talk about and communicate. And so having one way out of many of representing those changes and those risks, I think is important to enable people to have that conversation. So, I'm reminded that one of the first people who used this graphic was he was an American chap who wrapped his Tesla car in the stripes, rather dramatic. And he took it to a car show, and he said he had more conversations in that one afternoon about climate change than he'd had in the rest of the year put together. And it was purely because people came up to him and said, "What have you done to your car? Why does it look like that?" And it enabled him to have the conversation with them. They had approached him to spark that conversation about what the stripes represented and what we could do about it. And so it opens doors to have those very difficult conversations about what we can all do.
Mm-hmm. David, run us through the environmental tipping points and where we are with those.
Well, we heard from Jim that the Arctic Circle region is now heating up at 4 times the rate of the average for the whole planet. And this has been happening for now about 20 years. And let's just look at what's happening in the entire Arctic Circle region as a result. A recent paper published shows that Greenland is now losing ice, and has been over many years, up to a decade, losing ice at the rate of nearly 50 million tons an hour. That's a vast amount of ice loss. And why is that important to all of us? Because it's ice based on land. It'll enter the oceans. When all of Greenland ice has melted, sea levels will have risen by 7.5 meters. We certainly wouldn't be sitting here when all of that has happened. Now, the timeline on that is a question, but you're asking about tipping points. I do believe that without human intervention, we're now losing ice on Greenland irreversibly. Right? In other words, it's been happening, and it seems that the temperature is rising in that area faster. I can't see that that isn't irreversible without human intervention.
So it's still salvageable, but what needs to be done to salvage that?
So the Climate Crisis Advisory Group that I chair has put out a 4R strategy to create a manageable future for humanity. And the first R is, of course, reduce emissions deeply and rapidly. Isn't it astonishing that with all of this understanding of the risk, emissions are still rising without any hesitation? They are still rising. Now, of course, the global population increases, wealth increases, there's more demand for electricity, but why aren't we doing with urgency the switchover to renewable energy, to nuclear energy systems, and so on? So we are in the process of really creating the worst possible situation right now. Mm-hmm. Now, if we take all of this together, what it means is that we need the second R, and the second R is removing excess greenhouse gases that are already in the atmosphere. We wouldn't be seeing all these extreme weather events happening if it wasn't for the fact that we've already put too much greenhouse gases up there. Where are we today? The pre-industrial level, 275 parts per million carbon dioxide equivalent, and today we're at 425 parts per million of carbon dioxide, but add in methane, which is now rising more rapidly than before, and we are well over 500 parts per million. It's like putting a second duvet on your bed when you were already warm enough, and you're going to get very hot because these greenhouse gases are trapping the radiated energy from the surface of the Earth very effectively. Now, the third R is to repair those parts of the climate system that appear to have gone into irreversible behavior. So what a bunch of us are doing is seeing whether we can learn how to refreeze the Arctic Sea. During the polar winter months, that piece of the Arctic Sea that loses its ice very quickly in the summer regrows a thin layer of ice. Mm-hmm. Can we keep that ice there through the summer months?
How are you going to do that?
Well, there's a wonderful project
yes.
Called Real Ice, and it sounds bizarre, but they're simply pumping seawater onto the surface of the ice that is formed, and it freezes, and you thicken the ice surface. And they've done this at scale, meaning 1,000 square kilometers so far have been thickened by 25 to 35 centimeters. Mm-hmm. And that's them working 5 hours a day for a couple of months.
Okay.
So it seems to be working. Now, they have looked at how you can extend this to this vast Arctic Sea, and the answer is that it'll probably cost around, $50 billion to get it all up and running, and $10 billion a year. Now let me come to another factor we haven't discussed, which is loss and damage from the events that are happening today around the world. Very difficult to get figures on this, except when you go to the reinsurance and insurance industries. And actuaries have now, I've been pushing them for some time to do this, have now done a calculation, and they find that the loss and damage has a big positive feedback. So we see loss and damage increasing as the average temperature of the planet increases, and then it starts taking off. And it goes right up to 100% of global GDP. Now, when we talk about loss and damage, here's an interesting point. We don't see the figures. Why don't we see the figures? Because it's good for GDP growth. If you're going to get in there, collect the insurance money and fix it, it looks like your GDP is growing. So it's an astonishing factor. So I just want to really come to the last of the items, beginning with R, which is resilience. And we've already heard a few words about adaptation. Each part of the world needs to begin to adapt today. The Climate Crisis Advisory Group has produced reports comparing the behavior of different cities around the world. And we've got some good examples, such as Shanghai. The biggest water pumps in the world are already installed in Shanghai. And not such good examples, New York City, hit by Hurricane Sandy in the year 2012, and New York City devastated in that flood. The people got out, but the loss and damage, again, was massive. Now, what have they done? They brought in the US Army Corps of Engineers, who produced a report saying you'll have to build a wall around the city between 8 foot and 20 foot high. And they rejected that. We went into the mayor's office. They're still discussing what to do. This happened in 2012. There's an inertia which is almost unbelievable in the system. So what we are trying to do is show best practice and see that other cities can learn from that sort of best practice.
Ed, tell us a bit more about the focus of your work.
Mm-hmm. So I think a lot of focus at the moment is on understanding how extreme weather is changing, because I think that's how many of us are going to experience climate change directly, individually, is by changes in extreme weather. So, for example, every heat wave is now hotter because we live in a warmer world, and that has impacts on humans, as Emily's described earlier, and on the natural world. We also know that, when we get a heavy rainfall event like we saw in Dubai or in Greece last summer, more rain is coming out of those storms than would otherwise have been the case 20 years ago. And so more rain is falling, which makes it harder to deal with on the ground. We're seeing rising sea levels around our coastlines, causing coastal erosion. And that means whenever we get a big storm or a hurricane hitting different parts of the world, the storm surge is higher, which means we get more inundation and more flooding around our coast. So we're going to experience climate change often through the consequences of extreme weather becoming more intense and more damaging. And so understanding how that is happening, I think, is really important, because we often have thought about in the past that climate change is a future problem, but it's affecting us here and now everywhere. Everyone is already being affected by climate change, even if we don't realize it ourselves. And we will realize it when we are exposed to some extreme event that happens to occur where we are, and that event will be more damaging because of climate change. And the consequences will continue to get worse if we don't reach global net zero and stabilize global temperatures.
So what, for you, are the best ways to do that?
So I think we're certainly starting new projects at the moment to think about taking a real-world event and understanding how that event will be different in the past, but also in the future. Saying, okay, we've had these floods or this heat wave, we've had a 40-degree day in the UK a couple of summers ago. In 10, 20, 50 years' time, if we have that same weather pattern, how hot will it be? And what will we have to deal with to enable people to think about how we might adapt and deal with those consequences? How might we deal with 10, 20% more rain falling from a storm in London? which already struggles with flash flooding. So we need to make decisions now about how to adapt our society to deal with changes to extreme weather, which are going to come whatever, but it will also help communicate the fact that we can limit the damage by reaching global net zero.
Okay, so I was going to ask, I mean, you're talking about resilience and mitigation for the scenario that we're trying to avoid, but you're saying there are going to be extreme changes, whatever.
Yeah, we have to mitigate and reduce the consequences. We have to adapt to the changes we've already seen and the changes we're going to see, and we will also need to suffer because we're not going to mitigate or adapt well enough. So all of those three we are going to have to do.
Okay, so take us all forward 20 years in London on the current trajectory.
Yeah. So London will be hotter, right? So when we have conditions that are good for a heat wave, we will see hotter temperatures, which means more...
How much hotter?
No, so if global temperatures go up by a degree, we'll see the heat waves go up by 1.5 or 2 degrees. That's kind of the level that we kind of see happening at the moment. And our infrastructure is not designed to cope with those temperatures. It is designed in the 60s or the 70s for the climate that we had then, which is why our railways struggle in the heat, because our rails are designed to deal with a certain range of temperatures, and we've now shifted the range of temperatures the country gets, and so that causes problems. We can build railways and roads which can deal with hotter temperatures, but it costs a lot of money to build that new infrastructure. And so I think we also need to highlight the fact that it may cost quite a lot of money to reach net zero, but there are enormous costs of doing nothing. There are costs of not acting, and I think we need to discuss that aspect more, because yes, the costs might be frightening for acting, but they're even larger if we don't act, and that should help motivate taking the decisions we need to do.
One of your special areas of focus, Emily, is AI. Mm-hmm. What difference can that make?
So yes, a lot of my research now, as so many other areas, involves using AI, and we're really using it in two different ways. First of all, we're using a branch of AI called machine learning to help improve our understanding of climate-related risks and our projections of climate-related risks, exactly to inform things like how to adapt our infrastructure. And we do that by making better use of the wealth of data that we have, describing both the climate around the world, but also how weather and climate affects things like the way that the risks to our infrastructure. The other way in which we're using AI, and this is where we move into the hope part of the story from the despair part of the story. The other way we're using AI is in terms of helping to generate new solutions, and that's the innovation piece, and that's where I start to get slightly less depressed because I can
cheer us all up.
Cheer us all up, exactly. That's where we start to see real opportunities. So AI is being used in terms of helping transform our energy system, where we've got more renewable energy with solar panels, solar energy generation and wind energy. AI is being used to optimize the operation of wind farms and also optimize the grid, electricity grid, and the balancing of that. It's being used to help transform our mobility systems so that we can transform to much lower carbon forms of mobility. It's being used in our buildings. I think people are familiar with the way buildings are increasingly using smart systems. In agriculture to help move to more sustainable forms of agriculture, supporting circular economies, reducing waste, and also looking at using AI to help discover new greener materials for industrial processes. There's a wealth of different ways it's being used. I'm actually on the judging panel of something called the Manchester Prize, which is happening this year, and this is a prize for UK innovators to generate new solutions, particularly with a sustainability focus, but utilising AI. And the finalists of the Manchester Prize are going to be announced in the coming weeks, with the final prize being at the end of the year. So that's just one example of what I was saying earlier, that actually the response to climate change is a huge opportunity, both for this country and globally, to really capture our creativity and imagination and then channel that through innovation into creating the solutions of the future.
We've been talking about communication and saying you want people to have conversations just as a matter of routine amongst their friends and family. Now, we are in an election year. I mentioned about half of the world's population is going to be voting this year. And the question is, does this get discussed in the mainstream? Does this influence elections? In this country, Reform UK have said that they will make net zero one of their 4 key focuses for the election here. They want there to be a referendum on scrapping net zero. So my question to you is, do you think that net zero effectively becomes the new Brexit in terms of the focus for populist politics? And how do you feel about that?
Do you want to go first, Dave?
So I think, first of all, that I'm a bit worried about the phrase net zero.
Okay.
Because it doesn't state how much we have to reduce our emissions by. The most important thing is to reduce emissions by, if possible, 90%. There's some unavoidable remaining emissions. And then when we say net zero, what we ought to be saying is net negative. We need to be going into a period when we are removing excess greenhouse gases at scale. Now, if I can just put some numbers on this, I've already given you some. We are up there at over 500 parts per million carbon dioxide equivalent today. What's a safe level for humanity proceeding not to the year 2100, but proceeding perhaps for thousands of years going ahead? And the answer is probably about 350 parts per million or less, somewhere around that. Jim Hansen has done a very detailed analysis looking back in history 70 million years and looking at past behavior when greenhouse gases were at their current level, and then what do we need to get good behavior? And he says 350 parts per million. It's going to take us many decades to get it back down again to that level, but we need to focus on that. So for me, I'm just worried about the phrase net zero.
Okay.
It makes life look, well, it's all easy. We can keep emitting some carbon dioxide, and the fossil fuel industry is saying, keep emitting it all.
Yeah, the way that you've just framed it then is obviously it's about expanding the ambition. If the current ambition isn't cutting through, if there isn't the will to deliver it, what chance is there for what you've just described?
If there isn't a will to deliver it?
To deliver net zero, if there's the questioning about, should we really be aiming for net zero in 2050?
So what I'm saying is, actually that's not nearly enough. Yes, we need to understand the importance of getting rid of our dependence on fossil fuel and, of course, restoring forests wherever possible. But at the same time, we need to understand that we're now in quite a deep hole. And in order to get ourselves out of that hole, we have to work hard. I'm talking about 10 to 20 billion tons of greenhouse gas removal a year, possibly in the next 30 years, in order to get us into a safer place. And I think it's not beyond our ingenuity to do this, and nor is it beyond our financial capability, as long as, and this is, I think, a really important point to make, as long as people understand that we can't go on living the way we're living now. We are destroying our ecosystems. We need a cultural transition as well, in which we recognize that we are a part of nature, not apart from nature. And we have, over the last 2,000 years, decided to dump everything into the ecosystems of the world. But when you're 8 billion people on the planet doing that, we're in a destructive phase, self-destructive phase.
I want to give both of you a chance. We're almost out of time, but sort of 40 seconds for both of you just to wrap up.
Yeah, well, I mean, just on that, on your net zero question. So climate change isn't an opinion, it's a scientific fact. And the response that is required of climate change, as Ed has described, is not an opinion, it's a scientific fact. And so I think the critical element here in this election year, as you say, not just in this country, around the world, is really to create that exciting, positive vision that this conference is all about how we respond as a global community, as a country, to that scientific fact of climate change, and the scientific fact that we do globally have to rapidly reduce our emissions to net zero and beyond, as Dave describes. But how can we unlock the innovation? How can we unlock the jobs of the future? How can we unlock a new narrative of the future? That's, I think, what's exciting and what will, has to be the main story of the elections that are happening around the world, because it is all of our futures.
And I also think we need individual conversations as well. I'll come back to this point that people need to talk about how good their electric car is. Right? I had a friend who bought an electric car recently. He didn't buy it for any climate reasons. He bought it because it was fun to drive. Right? And so having these types of conversations about heat pumps, how good they are in your home, about maybe changing your diet. Have these conversations normally to show people there are positive stories about making these transitions. It is a positive opportunity to live in a healthier, better world, and we need to sell that story much more than we have at the moment. It's not about doom and gloom, it's about moving to a positive future.
Thank you all very much. Professor Emily Shukborough, Professor Ed Hawkins, MBE, Sir David King, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.